Welcome to the Neophytes of Narratology, the internet's most pretentious and pseudo-intellectual pursuit since, perhaps, Nietzsche's thus podcast Zarathustra, or Camus' renowned vlog of Sisyphus. While lesser men aspire to stand on the shoulders of mere giants, we at the Lost Signals will accept nothing less than titans. So join us as we delve into the fundamentals of narrative nuance and critique the critics who proclaim to know the universal qualities of effective storytelling.
Hello and welcome back to Neophytes of Narratology. I, of course, am Scott Thurlow, and I have transcended all medium. And tonight I am here with Jonathan Ian Manzer.
Hello.
And Stephen Amosi.
And I'm here as well.
And we're going to discuss a article sent to us by a friend of the show, Keith Bowman, which is titled Transmedia Storytelling by Henry Jenkins, which was originally published, or at least released, in 2003. So I think it's a pretty short article. It's like 4 or 5 pages at max. But I think it brings up a number of, at least 2, perhaps 3, very interesting points about how the acceleration, pretty much, I'll just say internet culture, but it's not just that, and the possibility of a story existing not just in one medium, say film, but being able to be expanded to other mediums like comics, etc., things like that, and the ways that it's sort of been done, or at least was being done at the time, and perhaps some better avenues to explore within that to create better stories and to expand the worlds and so forth that authors and writers have created.
I think this has a very long history to it. Of many films are created either from plays or novels that have come before. Mm-hmm. So there has always, it's not, was it
Transmedia Storytelling? I get what you mean.
It is not a new development, although his applications of it are.
I guess you're right. Like, just to quickly, if not rebut that, to add on to it. Yes, you're right about that, certainly. However, I think it's just the technology that we have at this time enables a lot more of it. And there's like you said, sure, there's plays and novels adaptations, but now we can have, like I said, comics and like full websites and so forth that Steve might talk about. So go ahead.
Yeah, precisely that. I think the idea is that they were at a point where this was supposed to explode, onto the scene in 2003. And to some degree it did, which we'll get into more as we go on. But I think that the idea was that with the advent of, the internet getting out there more, and, 2003 was, to our minds, at this point in 2017, still kind of early days for this, but there were already things happening that we will have seen a lot more of at this point.
I just want to make a slight warning here that I agree with a lot of the points that we've made. I'm just going to play devil's advocate quite a bit because I feel that his view of transmedia, which Scott, I believe, will get into later, is naive is a very harsh term, but he saw possibilities which I feel did not come to fruition. So I'm going to play the guy the curmudgeon here.
Right. Well, we can say that in hindsight, but I think I want to go on to the first point that he makes. That I thought this was funny. He sort of has a quick background as to why he wrote this article, and he was attending a gathering of top creatives from Hollywood and the games industry specifically, hosted by EA, which ironically, if you're into games, they're not the best ever of doing this kind of stuff. But anyway, I just want to point that out and make that joke. However, I think the point that is more relevant is that not only within that, he also mentions, say, filmmakers or animation studios. He brings up, he asked someone who worked within that industry how much creative control, or any, if at all, do they have over other such things as toys and any other ancillary materials. And they were basically none at all. And one of the issues is, what I thought was interesting, is that he points out that it's almost as if X little sector is working on X medium that they're within. And then almost competing against each other for an adaptation or a crossover to Y medium, whereas obviously the point that he makes, and the point that I agree with a lot, I think you guys might, and you'll talk about in a second, is that rather than that, there should be a coherence to them and a vision guiding them.
He does say at one point in the article that what the audience really wants is a group of people that are co-creators rather than adaptations, which
Exactly.
is kind of what you said at the beginning. Like that, what we've had up to this point is adaptations, and what he's saying is that he wants people that are creating new content within all these different mediums and new ideas that are spawning from the same wellspring.
Mm.
I'm going to rebut that idea or the natural failing of it. But the idea is that one medium will always take precedent over another. And he actually brings that up during the thing that it shouldn't be that way.
Well, maybe.
But I feel that it always will. And two, you then go into a problem of a glut of information, which is then it's you can't have one person overseeing every single aspect of a big name franchise. And that's why I think that there's reboots that happen nowadays. The thing that we need to erase one vision because that person left, and now we have to put new things in. And we'll go into that more, but I just wanted to.
No, yeah. I mean, that's somewhat true, and I see what you mean, but that sort of like somewhat segues into the other point that I think is a major one in this article that I want to we'll expand upon now, is that with the expansion of mediums and so forth, that if you're a fan of any given franchise, you don't basically want constant retreads of the same thing. You want if there's an interesting setting or characters or both, you want a different angle on those characters. You want a different timeline of the story of these characters that you're invested in already, like initially. That's sort of like the internet culture, like fans kind of demand that, or at least pushing towards it. And to your point, Ian, that, perhaps like, I guess if I had to rephrase what you just said, it's something like whichever medium the story starts in, that one might be like the core one.
By no means.
You just like one will overtake it.
One will overtake, but it doesn't necessarily
have to be the one that starts in.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, I would say that the one thing, and this is mentioned, I believe, in the article as well, is like there's one franchise that has been, and love it or only kind of like it. Star Wars has been doing this for years.
I think he brings another one. Pokemon, I think, is the example he uses most, because essentially you can get into any Pokemon, from any medium, and sort of like have enough information to know about the world, and then perhaps if that gets to you, then you will go in search of other ones in other mediums. Yes, like I see what you mean, that can't really have one person controlling the whole thing. I get that, one entity, but a core cadre perhaps that collaborates, and therefore there's more cohesion within, you're doing a film or a television series or comics or whatever it may be all at once, that there still has to be some sort of unifying aspects between them, even if they're not, and they shouldn't be a 1-to-1 ratio. However, the point that I want to get to, what that was raised in the article, is that you need to be aware of how to best use that medium in order to tell or expand whatever story / setting, etc., that you are working with. Right? You can't just slap something into a comic book and be like, okay, now we're in comic books. No, you should, work with people and artists and creative talent that knows how to use that medium.
Speaking of that, I would say that there are good and bad uses of like putting things into other media. And as you just said, comic book, the one that immediately came to mind for me is the Dark Tower series, which I was a big fan of the Dark Tower series, and they did a run of comic books, but those comics told the same exact stories that the novels did, which turned me off. And I started reading the first one. I was like, I've read this book. I don't really like it's it's interesting. There's good art or whatever along with it now, but like I don't need the same story again. What I want is something new with those characters that have been built in this world.
Sure, exactly. Like I just said, like diehard fans of any given franchise, at the end of the day, who wants a retelling? Like, you don't want the same story. You want, like, basically, well, what happened to Roland, to give to your Dark Tower example, what happened to him X here, like other points in his journey and his stories,
No, they don't. I'm going to bring up the Red Letter Media Plinkett review of the Star Wars franchise, which he does very well. So, Star Wars has a special place in a lot of people's hearts. It has a huge universe that is built in all the books, except none of the books are canon. to the new.
Well, some
Star
are and some aren't.
Wars.
That's the problem.
I don't think.
That's
I think
the
that there are
quagmire
certainly some books
about some of this stuff. Go on.
The prequels tried something different and failed. Now you can say that that's based upon poor choices in that, but Force Awakens was a retelling of the original tale. Rogue One used a very familiar. Yeah, yes, it's a slight break off of an established fact, but that had all of the elements that people liked from the original ones, and. Actually, the media makes a great point over the fact that it's not fan service necessarily, but it's a world that is limited by the desires of its fan base.
I guess, but that could be true of anything. Like, I don't want to make this just...
yes, it can be true of anything. Thus, people don't want anything too far different than what they already enjoy, or at least that was the point he was.
Well, I think that's what's going on in Star Wars is that you have an established canon that you have to work within, which will be true of any world building thing that you try to break off of. But what they do in the Star Wars movies and in the books and all that stuff is that they have new characters that you can follow,
that's what
that you can enjoy, and they have their own storylines. Yes, Force Awakens was very similar to New Hope, but granted, I may be assuming too much, but I'm going to assume that the second movie is not going to be a retelling of Empire, and the third movie is not going to be a retelling of
Return
of the Jedi. But
I mean, maybe.
But I am interested to see what happens to those characters in those.
I understand all that, and I don't want to make this again like specifically about Star Wars, although it is a pretty good example to because it's so prevalent, because it's crossed so many, if not all, mediums. But I just want to make a point that you just said, you feel as if that's true. Like maybe that's the LCD kind of thing. I just want to see the same thing again. Maybe, but to play devil's advocate to your devil's advocate, I would say certain, perhaps more well-rounded fans do want something different. And so, for example, that's how you can sort of expand the story. And I'll tie it in both ways. So yes, you have, you guys just said, you're working with established canon, but you can expand that canon because you have a world that you've already built. So as you said, Steve, introduce a new character or a side character that wasn't explored all that much in the original or X, trilogy. Mm-hmm. To start out with, and now that you have the ability and space within these mediums to expand, you can do so.
Now, I want to actually bring up, I think, an example that both shows, to your point, or the ability to universe building.
Okay.
But also shows the flaws of transmedia. And it's, I think, the most prominent one, which is the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Sure. All right.
Where they have attempted to create films, TV series, comic books. I'm sure there's novelizations out there. Video games, all encompassed under one scope, with one directed vision, except that the movies take precedence, even though they're not the source material. And in fact, the comics,
in a weird way,
have now, they are developing plot lines to match what movies are coming out.
So
sure.
There is an interesting Marvel explanation to that, which leave it to comic books to come up with this convoluted, crazy ass shit. But like the cinematic Marvel universe is a literally different universe than what the comics have been before.
And comics have always done
in
that kind
comic
of thing.
canon, just in order to maintain quote unquote canon. They have said that this happens in a different universe than all of it because Marvel has all these universes that are tied in.
It's the Earth 342 crap or whatever,
but I think that their movie, they make the majority of their money from the films
nowadays.
So I feel that
point,
the now foundational aspect of the Marvel universe, not the cinematic universe, the universe in general, is the films. So, for instance, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. became the first spin-off from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And it heavily ties into the events of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, except the MCU ignores completely Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D.
I mean,
and Netflix is producing perhaps the best series that things that Marvel have, but the films ignore at least for the time being, ignore
or they have. Sure.
Which is kind of fucking bullshit.
Right. Well, and let's not get into that.
Netflix ignores Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and Agent Carter and all that. Yeah. So there's a again, this goes to the fact that he wants to have every aspect be equal. And that
I don't know if he's saying that per se, but I see what you mean by that.
There's a line in there saying that no medium should take precedence over another, except that is the inherently how it will work.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to disagree with that because we just saw it in action pretty much. But I think the MCU thing is an interesting case because it's almost as if it reversed itself. Whereas, of course, the core of all these things, character, story, setting, come from comic books back in the day. But now you're right. They sort of set out because of that, as you said, Steve-O, classic comic convoluted canon. They set it out that, like, oh, it's actually, in quotes, separate. So they can have a whole separate sort of like huge world unto itself, but has like sort of lapsed itself into that medium, at least the films, that is to say, becoming more of the flagship and everything else sort of like hangs around it. It's like a giant whale or the little Omoras or whatever, Remoras, like hang off of it. I get what you're saying. And like perhaps that's an unforeseen like consequence of trying to do that didn't exist that when this paper was written.
It's tough to get that many people to all sign on to one artistic vision, like
I understand that, and that's what kind of wanted to explore a bit more as well.
Thus to my second point, that it will inevitably become too unwieldy for one man to control,
now,
or one cadre or whatever.
As a possible, not fix for that, but as a possible other solution to something like that, I had this idea. Or I started thinking about this idea like a long time ago, like probably around 2003 or so.
Mm-hmm.
But what do you guys think about? And I really haven't seen this done at all, as far as I can remember. And and I definitely haven't seen it done well. But what do you guys think about like a single work that is transmedia? And this is something I was thinking about a while ago. Like,
I think it doesn't exist yet. You're saying,
say you have like a novel that you have to go, like there's a section of the novel where you have to stop reading, go to YouTube and watch a video, or like, there is music that's supposed to be playing over the part that you're reading, and you can play that or something like that. Like I think that there's a lot that can be done with stuff like that if it's done right. And the problem is that there needs to be a framework for it, I think. Yeah. And that framework does not exist yet.
Yeah, you're going to try to figure one out.
Somebody needs to build a framework for it.
I like that. I like that idea, at least. It's very interesting. Of course, I don't know the answer to it either, but I think something like that must be true in order to...
They're getting closer. Like, you were telling me you were playing Watch Dogs, and you can literally take a picture of the screen.
Yeah, I can selfie myself in Watch Dogs.
There's, like, QR codes on the screen. You can take a picture, and your phone will come up with something. Or, like, in video games, you can be playing, like, as of now, you can be playing a game on a console and then move it off onto a handheld.
Yes, exactly.
Something like that.
I was going to...
which isn't necessarily a different medium, but...
I get it. Like, I was going to, of course, bring up games, being that, probably my biggest medium that I'm involved in. But I think certain ones, of course, will lend themselves to that more than others. But there is a quote I want to pick out here from the article that perhaps somewhat ties all this in, and then we can discuss after that. So he writes, In the ideal form of transmedia storytelling, each medium does what it does best, so that a story might be introduced in a film, expanded through television, novels, comics, and its world might be explored and experienced through gameplay as well. Each franchise entry needs to be self-contained enough to enable autonomous consumption. Yeah, that would be nice, and as you said, Steve-O, there might be a way to do that, but I have no idea what it is. But that's the idea, sort of, like, goal here. But you're saying that's never going to happen.
So I'm a cynic. And I'm going to make that whatever makes the money will have precedence. So He-Man and the Masters of the Universe back in the day
sure.
Go on.
was developed to sell toys. Pokemon.
Transformers as well.
Yeah.
Was that.
So I think that
I think Pokemon has been one of the most successful, though, because it's easy to... like, take canon and shove it to another medium.
Well,
there's not that much involved with it,
But I think it's also better because it's aimed at children, and they'll buy anything.
Well, maybe, but
they do love to buy stuff with their parents' money.
Exactly,
I get it.
I will say so. Like, this is another point that I had down actually. So, like, I was thinking about this, and it's probably easier to do this kind of transmedia storytelling in an epic or a world-building framework
Of course, because there's so much more room to move.
What are your opinions on trying to do something like this in like a tense drama? Like you haven't really seen that, or when you have, it hasn't worked. It hasn't worked.
That's very much true.
He brings up the Dawson's Creek in the article, and how like they had Dawson's essays or something, or his diary or whatever online while that show was going on, which really dates this article, by the way. But
nevertheless,
does anybody remember that? Like anybody who watched Dawson's Creek remember going and reading his essays or whatever? Like,
I see what you're saying. Like, but I think again, it goes to our point that it was an early attempt at doing such.
Right.
Sure. So did it work? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe fans at the time liked it. I'll bring up another one. He doesn't mention this. I don't remember if it was out at the time, but for example, Lost did a lot of that shit.
Heroes did the same thing.
They had like a fake Dharma Initiative website and all that crap to tie it in, to give fans that basically, give them more treats to get into the world.
But at least Lost had a large world building part of it.
I understand. So your question is, what kind of story would be
if you're telling if you're telling a localized drama or even a a sitcom or something, it doesn't work really with that.
That's true. So the question is not the question, but to answer that, Steve, I would say not every story is going to demand
I think he himself admits that.
Yeah.
Sure, there are certain ones that just A, isn't necessary, or B, if you attempt it, it's just not going to work because of the nature of the story you're trying to tell and the framework of it as a whole. Mm-hmm. Certainly, I don't think he's arguing that every single film should be adapted and vice versa or anything like that. Just that certain ones, and as we again develop, perhaps you will see more and more of it, and perhaps it will be better integrated within itself as a whole.
I'm looking forward to the next Sopranos or what's the motorcycle one?
Sons of Anarchy.
Sons of Anarchy, where I have to go out to a location to find a dead body
and cover it up.
Transmedia.
Sure, but I mean, and I was going to bring up this point. It's sort of
Transmedia with real life.
Yeah,
I like it.
Well, think of it this way, right? This is the thing I was going to introduce to you guys. The next perhaps medium might be something like VR. So that they can.
Well, I was definitely going to.
They can do VR stories. So yeah, sure, you can be a member of the Sons of Anarchy for an episode or two.
Yeah, or even the real life thing is a good example too. You go out geocaching basically, and go find stuff that's set out in the real world. That's kind of what the new Pokemon mobile game is trying to do.
That. Yeah, I get it, but
there's that element of augmented reality that they're trying.
Sure,
to...
you're right. And that's, I think a valid avenue as well. Again, if done, or at least integrated well enough with some kind of vision, if not one overseer, running it all.
Yeah, I think we certainly have yet to see a truly brilliant use of this.
See, the thing is, Pokemon has a plot to it, I guess. They always introduce a new trainer.
Team Rocket's the bad guy.
No, not anymore.
But not even always. Sometimes, yeah.
Are they not anymore?
Yeah,
I don't know. I haven't watched Pokemon.
It doesn't matter. Go
but the idea is that my big complaint or my big worry is if you're not just a local drama as you brought, but anything that requires tight storytelling over. Because here's the thing: is let's say you do have a Game of Thrones thing where it's required you play a video game, you read a book, and you watch a TV show that has nothing to do. And it's required knowledge for one of those, to have all three of those.
Sure.
That adds a level of burden that would...
most consumers aren't going to commit to, is what you're saying.
That's where you're really going to run into a problem. These all need to be standalone things, but also canon, right? So well,
that's what he said. So if you allow me, I'll try to quickly, at the end of the paragraph I just read from earlier, he writes, as Pokemon does so well, any given product is a point of entry into the franchise as a whole.
Yeah.
Which, sure, you can't, that's pretty narrow example of how you can do that.
But it's kind of a brilliant way to do it, as far as they did. You can jump in on the TV show, you can jump into the games, you can jump in on the movie. I think they had one or two
comics
movies
for sure as well.
Yeah.
I get it. But yeah,
I don't know if the comics work as well, but
it doesn't matter. It works. I'm saying it works for that one example. Certainly that's not going to be the case for a lot of things, I would say, to Ian's point. So I would agree with that aspect of it.
But if you're going into something with transmedia storytelling in mind, that's something you have to think about, right? Is how well can we make multiple points of entry into this world, right? This is something that doesn't need to hinge on one character.
Right.
or it necessarily should not hinge on one character.
Sure.
It's things like this, I think, and now I'm expanding upon what I was talking about earlier, things like this should be all about the world that exists, and if you drop in anybody's life who's having an adventurous life in this world, you're going to have a good time in the world. You know, there's something interesting for you there.
Sure. Well, I'll try to tell it all together because I think what you just said and what E just said, it's almost like a double-edged sword / two sides of the same coin. Yeah, you want to have everything you just said, Steve-O, but also you don't want to have so much information that you have to take in from so many different mediums that it becomes overwhelming.
Yeah.
And you have to commit so much to it. But it ties into one of the points that I said was, what I raised earlier was contained into it, that, yeah, you want more in-depth content, not just a lot of content that has no substance to it, but that still has to have a balance to it. I would agree with that.
Yeah. No, I agree.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, I just think it's interesting to see what, works that are coming out or in and around in the past, let's say 5 years or so, that may do that. For example, like something I would like to see, I think I brought it up quickly off cast, is that Westworld just ended, and during when it was on, they had a faux website for the Delos Corporation that owns the park. You said if you're familiar with anything Westworld, but yeah, you can explore it that way. You didn't really need to know, or if you did, of course, it was more. But that's always been the case, right? It's almost like Easter eggs.
I will say this with Westworld, I think that they hit on the perfect media for that in terms of a TV show. They could railroad their characters into what they want them to do. Like, I don't know if a video game would work all that well for Westworld.
Well,
it would have to be really well done.
It's really funny you mentioned that because I read an interview with Jonathan Nolan while it was premiering, like 2 or 3 episodes into it. And he said, because of the nature and the theme of Westworld specifically, that, and what he was commenting on, I believe his exact words were, his quote was, a Westworld video game would be very deeply ironic, in a sense.
Like that's yes, but that as well for sure. But I get
what you're saying.
I think it would be tough to do a good video game, irony notwithstanding. But there are all those little like Easter eggs that you can give in a website or whatever, like something like that. A movie would be probably too short to explain anything what's going on with Westworld. I get it.
But
so I'm a huge fan of Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
So you have the George R. R. Martin books. You have the television show, which actually is, interestingly enough, may not be a one-to-one.
Right, it's like the MCU
novels.
kind of thing.
You have the Telltale game, which was based more so
on
off the show than it was the books.
There's also comics.
There's comics. Yep. I believe there's other games as well. I actually think the Telltale game is the perfect example of this. It took a minor house that I don't know if it was even referenced in the books, but they worked it into the narrative very well, and you saw some of the characters that were in there.
Exactly. I think it's perfect, almost world expansion. It done in the best way, using the medium that it used. And here's the thing I guess I wanted to say. That's always going to be true that if you're a fan of something and you've read or seen or whatever, like played more of X, then you're just going to know more. So
but that's actually, I'm sorry to cut you off, Scott, but I want to go on a little bit more about that before we move on. But that's actually a perfect example of what he's talking about in this article. Is Game of Thrones. The video game gives you more of what you want, but also from a different perspective.
Yeah,
you get to meet a different character.
Anything.
And the comics do the same thing.
And HBO's talking about having a prequel of Robert's Rebellion, which would, again, build off of
for sure.
The world. And then you have all of the other George R. R. Martin works that he's doing instead of writing Winds of Winter. So
I said it was coming soon. But no, I mean, regardless, it just made me think of something. There was one somewhat decently done thing where, if you guys remember Alan Wake, which I very much like that game. So, and it was like, that game itself was framed as if it were a TV show. There were like episodes, it was like...
That's right. Within the game, there's transmedia,
there's that too, yeah. There's that too. But like on top of that, they did put out little, very short, like 7-minute actual live action little like web series.
Basically Twilight Zone stuff, right?
No, that's what I'm talking about, right? Okay. On top of that, the Twilight Zone stuff, the Night Spring stuff was in-game stuff. What I'm talking about is that because the chapters of the game are cut up as if they were TV episodes. You'd be like episode 1 with a title to it when you got to like 2 hours or so into the game. But then they also released like just actual videos with live actors that expanded the world. but it wasn't the character Alan Wake himself. It was like something else happening in the world. But I thought it was pretty decently done. So if you were a fan, you probably appreciate that stuff. If you hadn't played the game, you almost certainly got less out of it. But perhaps it was a good entry point into getting you into the game or something like that. Like, for example, another recent one I'll bring up. We recently reviewed Assassin's Creed at the end of last month. And whatever flaws that movie may have, which are not numerable, but they're all flaws.
Many.
But all I'm saying is this. I think it was a smart idea, at least at the outset. It was not a one-to-one adaptation of any one character from any one game. It was basically a world expansion thing. And yes, there was a lot of baggage going into it. If you were a fan and you knew a lot of back information, if you weren't, they had to spit it to you somewhat awkwardly. But nevertheless, it was at least an attempt at transmedia storytelling within a world that had already been established.
Yeah, I think I have one last point to make about this. I don't know if you guys want, but the idea of like fan nods over the course of things that might not be one-to-one
kind
of thing, but that's perhaps my favorite usage of transmedia in a way, or I feel the most reliable in a sense, that you can have a nod to a inspiration or to another thing within this world, the universe they built. I just thought
that is really interesting, and if done well, I think nods to the fans are great. The problem is it's very easily overdone, and then it's just obnoxious.
Sure, exactly.
But you're right. Like, at least being able to tip your cap to the fans that have gotten you to the point of being able to make something in another media off of the original thing that you did is really nice. And being able to do it subtly is an art in and of itself,
sure,
I think.
I definitely would agree with that, of course. So I'll just make one more point. Actually, we sort of, not forgot, but it somewhat ties into almost everything we just said. He writes that a lot of the stuff would make economic sense because different media attract different market niches. Right. So sure, for example, you may not be a comic fan, but if you're a fan of something that is a story outside of comics, you may start to get into it just because of that, or pick any medium you want.
Well, there may or may not be a Sandman movie coming out, or a show coming out. There is American Gods.
American Gods, right?
Is coming out soon.
But that's more of an adaptation.
But I think that a lot of people, similarly to Game of Thrones, a lot of people are going to watch that didn't read the book and then go and read the book.
Exactly. So like, while that's not quite the same thing, at least it's like getting closer to like true, if I may call it in quotes, true transmedia storytelling. But I think certainly we'll see a lot more of it. And like we said, we touch upon as VR develops, I think that is the hugest unexplored avenue to do something like this.
Sure, there's a lot of availability there for pretty much anybody who's willing to work and spend the time to develop something.
So yeah, I mean, like I said, this is a pretty good pick. So we'll give Keith a shout as well. Just good looks absolutely. On this one.
Thanks, Keith.
We like this one a lot, and I think it definitely has driven some interesting conversation, interesting points to think about as applied to like all the mediums that we cover on the Lost Signals and just technology and our society and culture in general.
Absolutely. So,
you guys got any final thoughts or anything you wanted to add?
I think that's it for me. I went over all my notes that I had written down. So
nope.
Alrighty. Well, we will be transmeeting ourselves across. I don't know. We'll be filming ourselves in the future as well.
That's true.
Experience our media that way.
But I think look at our ugly mugs.
Well, speak for yourself. We'll expand the story so we're not as ugly. But anyways, I think that'll do it for this one. I've been Scott Thurlow, as always, here with Jonathan Ian Manzer.
The biggest crossover in the Lost Signals history.
And Stephen Amosi.
The biggest crossover?
Yeah, because we did film, video games, so syntax error, bon mots.
True.
Mots
this has to do with everything. You're right.
It's Trans Podcast.
Yeah. We transmedically did everything here.
Have a good night.
All right, we'll see you next time.
This has been the Neophytes of Narratology. We hope that you've experienced an epiphany or two of the literary nature, but only metaphorically, of course.
Editing and engineering by Jonathan Ian Manzer. Music by Christopher Morgan. Check us out on YouTube and iTunes for the shows, and on Facebook and Twitter for updates.